All right, so we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let's begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei Abalin Latovi, all in Sarah Kelman, in celebration of completion of Seder Nezikin, and for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Nathan Perry Smith, in schos of the entire Kehila. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Chadosh Baruch Hu will bring all of our hostages home, b'shalom and b'karav, allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yedehem, and halavai we should be zochem, Eretz Hashem, harachamonu yakim lanu as-sukkah stavet hanofalas, we should be zochem, Eretz Hashem, for the restoration of the ultimate sukkah of Klal Yisrael, the sukkah of Beis HaMikdash, the geula of Klal Yisrael, Mashiach, Tchias HaMesim, and halavai, Eretz Hashem, shalom, for all of Klal Yisrael. With that, let us be. We have a really beautiful daf ahead of us, a really excellent daf. Today is Chaf Beis 22, and we are picking up on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis 21b, about 5 lines up from the bottom at the 2 dots. Gufa, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. Let's remember again. This is a statement that was already quoted by the Gemara a little bit earlier on. The Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. Kol kiyar shin kidei lekadish arba kahanim mimenu. So any kiyar that doesn't have the ability to sanctify 4 kohanim at the same time, which Rabbi Yossi essentially means the kiyar has to have 2 things. It sounds like what the Gemara is saying over here is, number one, it has to have enough water to be able to go ahead and sanctify 4 kohanim at the same time, and enough spigots or spouts to be able to go ahead and sanctify 4 kohanim at the same time. So minimum of 4 kohanim have to be able to use the kiyar simultaneously in order for it to be kosher. Says the Gemara. Where do we know this from? So Gemara says, if you can't do that, in Mekachinbo, ultimately again, then use it for consecratorial purposes. Where do we know this from? Shneimar v'rachatzu mimenu Moshe, Aaron, Ubanov. Because the pasuk says, ultimately, when referring to the kiyar, who will wash from it? Moshe, 1, Aaron, 2, Banav, minimum of 2 more, for a total of 4. I will say, by the way, there's also a beautiful and tremendous Musar Haskell in this. What do you see from here? Kedusha never occurs alone. Kedusha can never occur by yourself. Kedusha always requires a group. The ultimate Kedusha that we find is always when we embed ourselves in community, in Kehila, in a Chevra. By yourself, you could only get so far. But if you want to really come with Hashem, you want to really come in close proximity to the Ribono Shel Olam, by definition, that is always going to require your obligation, or your need. They're always going to require the embedment, if that's a word, embedding with some greater cohesive group. Incredible. Mason Marizakasha, Kol HaKelim, Mekachinbo. So we'll say one second. The Bryce says as follows: all Kelim can be used for consecration purposes. Right? This is talking about in the Beis HaMikdash. All Kelim can be used for consecration purposes. Bein sheyish bahen revius, top of Gimel, Chav Beis, Bein she'im ben revius. So ultimately, Yanabo says, so now, halacha l'maisa, for kiddush adai v'raglayim, you could use any Kelim, any utensils, whether the utensil has a revius, whether it doesn't have a revius, top of Chav Beis, or bilvad she'ehu kli sharis. What's the one requirement? It has to be a service utensil. It has to be a kli sharis. So we'll say, so that's taloch. You have to use a kli sharis. Now again, how an item ultimately again becomes a kli sharis, that's a different discussion into. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Bein she'im ben revius, halog mayim, v'apal gav deleka shiura gabi netel zadayim legabi kiddush lo ba'inan shir. So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. Apparently, by kiddush adayim v'raglayim, sanctification of hands and feet, there is no requisite amount of water that has to be used. We're going to contrast this with Natilas Yadayim in just a moment. But by Kiddush Raglayim, you have to wash your hands and feet, but there's no minimum amount of water that has to be used. And therefore, the Brisa says that Allah Chalamaysa, you could use any utensil with any amount of water for sanctification of hands and feet, provided that the utensil itself is a Kli Sharis, a service utensil. So that contradicts what we just said before. Because before the Gemara just said, right, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said that you have to use a utensil that is capable of sanctifying 4 kohanim. Here we're saying any utensil is permitted. So what's going on over here? Rav Ada Baracha Bekodach Besocho. What's the case? Kodach Besocho literally means you're boring a hole into the side ultimately of the kiyar. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Bekodech Besocho. Rashi says Kodech Dofno shel kiyar v'tochav b'socho kli katan umiksaso l'chutz v'yonik mimei hakiyar umotzi. So I see, interestingly enough, the Gemara's fascinating interpretation. When the Brisa says that any kli is good for kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, so ultimately, again, what is it referring to? If you were to make a hole in the side of the kiyar, and you were to go ahead and put a utensil in there and siphon off water in that, from that, or through that, ultimately that would work for kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. In other words, technically speaking, the water is not coming out of the kiyar; it's coming out of the kli, utensil that is bored into the hole, into the side of the kiyar. So the Gemara says whatever size that kli is, that's absolutely fine. Okay, let's finish up Rashi. So that's the idea. So in other words, what the Gemara is saying is like this: you need a utensil that is capable of washing or holding water to wash 4 kohanim simultaneously. If you were to take that large kli, bore a hole into the side of it, and siphon off water through a smaller kli, it would still be good. It would still be good. Why? Because the mothership, the mother kli, still has enough water to go ahead and wash 4 kohanim simultaneously. But just a kli, a small kli, even if it's a kli shares, if it does not have enough water for 4 kohanim, ultimately unfit for kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. The Gemara says, Vaha mimenu amrachmana. But how could that be? In other words, in a case where you're boring a hole into the side of the kiyar, siphon water with a smaller kli, how does that work? Because then you're not washing from the kiyar, you're washing from the smaller kli. And the Torah says, mimenu, you have to wash from the kiyar. What's going on over here? The Gemara says, Yirchatzu l'rabos kli shares. The Torah uses the lashon of yirchatzu, right? And what does yirchatzu teach me? Yirchatzu teaches me ultimately, again, that from any kli shares, any service utensil. So yirchatzu is just like a general statement. They have to wash. What do they have to wash from? Anything that has the status, ultimately, again, of a kli shares, ultimately is going to be good. The Gemara says, 1 second. Ihachi kli chol nami. Well, 1 second. If that is true, that yirchatzu teaches me that they can go ahead and wash from any utensil, then why do you need a kli shares? Even a kli, even a mundane utensil should work. Amrabaye kli chol lo matzis amrit mikal v'chomer mikano. Suppose this is very interesting. You can't use a kli chol. Why can't you use a kli chol? Based on kal v'chomer from kano. Kano, Abba is the base of the kiyar. The base of the kiyar. Now, Abba say, now this is very interesting. Let's read this, and then we're going to go back and analyze this a bit more. So where it says, Uma kano shenimshach ima in makadesh. Now, the base of the kiyar. Now, Abba say, the kiyar itself was apparently made up of 2 pieces. There was what we'll call the laver or the receptacle, which was the area that actually housed the water and had the spigots or the spouts, and then that sat in a base. That base was called the kan. So the Gemara says we can make a kavachon from kano. Now the base, which was actually anointed together with the kiyar, because remember, again, I will say these are service utensils. All service utensils are anointed with shemen hamishcha, all right, are anointed with anointing oil. So if the base itself, which was anointed, yet the base cannot be used for actual washing, certainly, again, then a mundane utensil, which was not anointed at all, certainly cannot be used for kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Now, a word about the kan. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, actually, no, look at Tosas. Kal v'chomer mikano, you see Tosas right across to the left, about 6 lines down. Kal v'chomer, sheyesh lo toch, va'asui kimin teva prutza lemala, va'kir yoshev alav. Now, both saying, from the Gemara's point of view, from the Gemara's discussion, it sounds like that the base essentially was hollow. In other words, that it was a base in which the kiyar sat in. So you have the kiyar, which is the actual wash basin, that sat in a base. But the base, it sounds like, had a cavity, and the kiyar sat in the cavity. And that's why the Gemara discusses washing from the base itself, because since the base had a cavity, the base could hold water. Tosas just points out, very interesting, he says, for Rabbi Piresh, ke'ein yore kefuya alpia v'niftechu shulaha. Rabbi says, on the other hand, see, Rabbi has a different interpretation. Rebbe darshans over here that in fact it looked like an overturned pot. Now I was saying if it was an overturned pot and the kiyar sat in it, that means it didn't really have a cavity. So again, Tosfos is just pointing out over here that there happens to be a machlokes about how the kan itself was actually made. Seems to be the first approach makes the most sense for this discussion, where there was a cavity on top that could be filled with water, and ultimately, again, the kiyar sat in it. Okay, so the Gemara's point over here is that halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara says, how do you know that you cannot use a mundane utensil, non-kli sharis? Because if the base, which was anointed together with the kiyar, can't be used, then certainly a kli chol, which was not anointed at all, cannot be used. Incredible. I asked the Gemara, 1 second. Vikano minalan. How do you know that you can't use the base? I was supposed to say, why not? Who's to say if the base itself was indeed anointed? So then why can't I fill up the base ultimately with water and wash from there? So how do you know that you can't? Tisanyo, Rabbi Huda says, Yochol yehi kano mekadesh k'derech shakir mekadesh. You might have thought that the base has the ability to consecrate, much in the same way that the kiyar has the ability to consecrate. Talmud Lomar, Vasisa, Kiyar Nechoshes, the pasuk says, you shall make a kiyar. So you're going to say, understand these were two pieces. You would not know this, by the way, per se, just from the psukim in the Torah. You would have not known that there are two pieces. In other words, you could have just as easily imagined this as one piece. The top piece, the kiyar, which is the actual water receptacle, and the bottom piece, the base, but one could have imagined them to be one comprehensive piece, one cohesive piece. Kamashal, the Gemara says, they're two different pieces. So what do you see from here? Vasisa kiyar nechoshes, vikano nechoshes. There's a kiyar, ultimately again of nechoshes, and a kano, and a base of nechoshes. Lenechoshes hikshesiv, velo ledavar acher. Ultimately again, for nechoshes, for copper, ultimately again, so we are comparing it, but not for anything else. In other words, both say the comparison between the kiyar and the kano is for one purpose only, which is materials. They're both to be made out of copper, but ultimately, again, from a usage perspective, they are going to be fundamentally different. The kiyar is used to wash, and ultimately, again, the kan is not. So you cannot wash from the basin itself. But now we'll say, comes on Marzuch, just 1 second. This is not necessarily a good comparison. I will say, what is the kan made for? What is the kan made for? The kan is made simply to be a support for the kiyar. It is not made, it's not made to use its interior. It's not made to be used as a receptacle. But yet a kli chol, ultimately again, halacha l'maisa, a regular service utensil is used. I should say not a service utensil. A regular utensil is made to be used for its interior. So in other words, just because you cannot use the kan, ultimately, the kiddush adayim v'raglayim, should not necessarily dictate that you can't use a kli chol. Why should you? Because we'll say, you understand the distinction? The kan is not made to be used as a receptacle. The kli chol is made to be used as a receptacle. So perhaps I should be able to use the kli chol even though I can't use the kan. So it says, Ella mimenu l'mi'ute kli chol. Rather, we'll say the pasuk says, mimenu, you shall wash from the. And this comes to exclude a kli chol, right? A regular mundane utensil. Ihachi kli shares nami. Well, 1 second. If that's the case, I will say that mimenu should exclude anything other than the kiyar, the kiddush adayim v'raglayim. Right? Mimenu should say if you want to wash your hands and feet for the service, it has to be done from the kiyar. Even a regular kli shares, therefore, should not be usable. What's the problem? We just said on the top of Chaf Beis that you can use a regular kli shares. So what's going on over here? To which the says, so how do you know? In other words, why do you include a kli shares and exclude a kli chol? It's very simple. The Gemara says, Ze ta'un meshicha kamohu, ze ein ta'un meshicha kamohu. To which the Gemara answers, there is a very simple distinction. What's the simple distinction? A kli shares requires meshicha, requires anointing, just like the kiyar. A kli chol does not. Therefore, it makes sense to include ultimately, again, a kli shares in the ability to be used for kiddush and raglayim and to exclude a kli chol. Therefore, we'll say, what does the Gemara come out with over here? Again, we're not totally finished with the sugya, but the Gemara comes out like this. Obviously, kiddush and raglayim can be accomplished by the kiyar, and that's the ideal. That's the ideal. Gemara seems to indicate minimum share of a kiyar ultimately again is going to be to wash 4 kohanim at a time. Okay, the kiyar had a basin. That basin was like the kiyar in that what? Two things. Number one, it had to be made from cotton. Number two, it had to be anointed. But you cannot wash from the basin. You can wash from a kli sharis. You cannot wash from a kli chol. There seems to be all the takeaways from the Gemara. So both say, so ultimately, again, how do we pass? And so I'll just read to the Rambam quickly, because there's a lot of Rambams I want to try to get to today. The Rambam says, mitzvah lekadesh v'mei akiyar. It is a mitzvah for the kohen to sanctify his hands and feet from the kiyar. V'im kidesh me'echad mikli sharis harei zeh kasher. But interestingly enough, if the kohen washed his hands and feet from any kli sharis, it's good. But you need a service utensil. Ava kli achol ein mekachin. But if a kohen washes his hands and feet from a mundane, non-service utensil, ultimately, again, it does not work. It does not work. A couple of other details over here. The Gemara says, fine, good. So that's our takeaways. By the way, we're going to see that Rambam does paskin that the kiyar itself has to be large enough that 4 kohanim can wash it from the same time. That is going to be halacha l'maisa. A kohen ideally should wash from the kiyar, but he can actually wash from any kli sharis, from any service utensil. That's halacha l'maisa from the Rambam. Okay, now let's go back a little bit. Another interesting discussion over here. Amr Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish says, "Kol mashlu l'mei mikvah, mashlu l'mei kiyar." Shabbos said, this is very interesting. Ultimately, again, whatever type of liquids are suitable to complete a mikvah are suitable ultimately, again, for the kiyar as well. For the kiyar as well. Now, I just want to point out something very interesting over here. Just, if you notice, there is a shear for the kiyar, but there's not a shear for kli sharis, right? The kiyar, as in its identity as a kiyar, has to be able to wash 4 kohanim at a time. But yet a kohen could wash his own hands and feet from any kli sharis, whatever the size of that kli sharis. Why? Okay, because why? There's no shear for kiddush adayim v'raglayim. So just to keep all that in mind. Now, the Gemara says, so now that we understand that there is a shear for the kiyar, right? A kiyar has to have enough water to wash 4 kohanim. So the Gemara says, Rish Lakish says, when thinking about the liquids that could complete this shear, whatever liquids complete a mikvah, ultimately, again, complete the kiyar. So the Gemara says, the revius eino mashlim. But ultimately, again, for revius, these additional liquids ultimately, again, do not complete. Now, what's the revius? Rashi points out over here, revius is the minimum amount of liquid that is needed, ultimately, again, for netilas yadayim, for washing your hands, negel vaser, bread. Whenever there's a din of netilas yadayim, you need a minimum of a revius of water. So we'll say, now watch this. So this list of interesting liquids, which I can complete a mikvah, which we're going to go through, complete a mikvah, could also complete the requisite shear in the kiyar. But for revius, for hand washing, you always require water. So the Gemara says, "Lemiute mai." Now, what does this come to exclude? So the Gemara says, "Lemiute tit hanidok." Maybe it's come to go ahead and exclude liquidy mud. Liquidy mud. So the Gemara says, "Hechidami." Well, what's the case of liquidy mud? Ida parashocha v'shosa b'menafilu revius nami. If a cow would drink it, in other words, if it's liquidy enough that a cow would literally again bend down and drink it, then we'll say that's water. That's water. If it's water, then halacha l'maisa, again, it's certainly going to be good for mikvah. It's going to be good for kiyar, and it's even good for netilas yadayim, because water is water. And if a cow would not bow down and drink from it, ultimately, or bend down and drink from it, I feel l'mikvah nami einamashim, that it wouldn't even be good for a mikvah. Ella, so this is very interesting. So what does it come to exclude? Yavchushin adumin. Rather, it comes to exclude these red. Yavchushin literally are like gnats or bugs. Now, what is this referring to? Take a look at Rashi. Yavchushin adumin, red yavchushin. Kamin yetushin, these are like the type of gnats or small little insects below kinafayim that don't have wings. Kiderach shegadol b'shulei chavio shel yain shalom mibachutz. Yavchushin dakin af hein nivra min hamayim. So apparently, again, I will say, there would be like these small little insect-like gnats that would grow in the water. So interestingly enough, because they grow in the water, this is fascinating, halachically, at least according to the Gemara, they have the status of water. So therefore, again, the Gemara says as follows, it's coming to exclude Yavchushin Adumin. So the Gemara says, that's what? That halacha l'maisa, that although these red insect-type things can complete the shear for mikvah, can complete the shear for the kiyar, ultimately, again, for revius, do not count as a revius of water. So the Gemara says, 1 second, afilu beinayu nami, but 1 second, those are fine even by themselves. Why was this pretty wild? Anything that comes from the water ultimately is treated like water, and therefore you could immerse in it. So the Gemara says, Saloch lamaisa, these red little yavchushin, because they come from the water, of water, and therefore get ready for this. And therefore, we'll say, technically speaking, if you were to go to a mikvah of yavchushin adumin, okay, right, not on the bucket list, right? But lamaisa, right, if you were to immerse in a mikvah full of these items, technically speaking, it would work. Similarly, the Gemara says, matbilin be'eno shal dag. So we'll say, this is very interesting. If you were to have a very large fish, right, and that fish ultimately, again, were to wash up on shore, and its eye were to dissolve, you could go ahead and immerse yourself in the eye jelly of the fish, right? Why? Because again, I will say, because halacha l'maisa, since the fish comes from water, therefore halacha l'maisa, the fish itself has the status of mayim. So because of that, ultimately, again, you could fully immerse in it. So again, therefore, anything that comes from the water by definition has the status of water. Incredible. Amra Papa. So we'll say, remember again, we'll say, just to understand what we're trying to do over here. Rish Lakish made a statement. What was his statement? His principle. Any liquid that completes the requisite shear for mikvah, completes the requisite shear ultimately again for the kiyar, but does not work for the revius needed for natilas yadayim, because for natilas yadayim, for hand washing, you always need water. Always need water. So we're trying to figure out over here what's being included, what's being excluded. So therefore the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, good. Amra Papa, listen to this. Nasan sa'a v'natal sa'a. So Papa says it comes to exclude the following case. The case of where you put in a sa'a and you take out a sa'a. Now what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi here just a moment. Rashi says over here, first white line in Rashi, L'mi'ute nasan sa benatal sa, l'mi'ute hanach minim, disnan b'hain l'gami mikva, pamim ma'alin and pamim ein ma'alin. Me peiros, v'chol mashke she'eno mayim, v'tamed she'hechmitz, v'katani hasam, this will say. So let's say you have liquids that by themselves are not fit for mikvah. For example, fruit juice. Right? Fruit juice is not fit for a mikvah. So now both say, now watch this. So Rashi says over here, v'tani hasam, Pamim malin pamim animal. Kitzad mikvah shish b'lamet esid v'nafla sa'a mehen l'socha lo ha'laso perish lo yishimoso v'af lo pas laso. So also listen to this. So let's say you have a mikvah that's 39 sa'a. Remember, a minimum share of a mikvah is 40 sa'a. You have 39 sa'a, and then one sa'a fruit juice falls in. Obviously, the mikvah is not going to be good. Mikvah is not going to be good, right? Because you don't have requisite mikvah. But listen to the following case. The Gemara says, Pamim demalin kitzad hayu b'socha arba'im sa'a michuvanos. Nosan samilu aminim v'natal sa akarnesina kasher debatanach. We'll say, watch this. Let's say I have a mikvah of 40 sa'a, and then I put in there a sa'a of fruit juice. Okay, what's the status of the mikvah? Status of the mikvah? Kasher, right? Now let's say I remove a sa'a from the mikvah. So the halacha is the mikvah is still kasher. Why? Because essentially, once I had a 40 sa'a mikvah and fruit juice, that sa'a fruit juice is batal. It's batal. So now when I remove a sa'a, we're good. We're good. Now watch this. So go back to the Gemara Papa. L'mi'ute nasan sa'a v'natal sa'a. This nan mikvah shish b'mem sa'a mechuvanos. If a mikvah has exactly 40 sa'a, nasan sa'a, so you put a sa'a of something pasul in there. V'natal sa'a harei kasher. So if you put in a sa'a of something pasul, and then you remove a sa'a, the mikvah is still kasher. Because also remember, once the mikvah introduce non-kosher material, the non-kosher material becomes to the mikvah, so that even if you remove a sa'a, that's fine. Because in other words, you had a 41 sa'a mikvah, you removed the sa'a, you still have a 40 sa'a mikvah, you're good to go. Now, interestingly enough, you can keep doing this as long as what? As long as you know that you maintain a majority of water. In other words, you could keep putting in, taking out, as long as you know that 51% of your mikvah is water. Amra Papa, im kadach bo revius. So I'll say, so therefore again, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, all of this works for a mikvah, for a kiyar, but is not going to work for netilas yadayim. When it comes to netilas yadayim, you need a revius and you need a revius of water. And that's it. None of that, I don't want to use the word games, right? But none of these other halachic mechanisms come into play. Well, there's another interesting halach over here. It's a very interesting idea over here. So Rav Papa says, imagine for a moment you have a mikvah, and then in the side of the mikvah you bore a hole. And in the hole you put a kli the size of a revius. Now, both say now when the level of the mikvah is at the same level of that kli, obviously you can immerse anything in that. We'll call it the tunnel of that kli. So Rav Papa introduces over here that halacha l'maisa, even if the water level drops below, you could still immerse small items in that tunnel of the kli, right? In that tunnel over there, right? That little kli. Why? Because since the water in that kli ultimately comes from the mikvah, therefore it's going to be kosher for immersion purposes. Interesting. Somewhere it says as follows. So ultimately, again, whatever waters are fit for a mikvah are also fit for the kiyur. The kiyur shayim vraglayim. Now, 1 second, that is a big statement, right? Because remember, the Gemara says that the waters of a mikvah are kosher for the waters of the kiyur, which would indicate to us that the kiyur does not have to be spring fed. Right? The kiyur doesn't have to be spring water. Mayim Chaim, right? They say Mayim Chaim is not just a Haimisha brand of seltzer, right? In other words, Mayim Chaim again is spring water. So you tell me that ultimately, again, that the kiyur ultimately can be mikvah water. Now again, Abba said, what could a mikvah be made from? Mikvah can be spring water, but could also be collected rainwater. So now that you're telling me that a water of a mikvah is used for the kiyur, that means it doesn't have to be spring fed. Is that true? Remember the Torah says, now this is actually talking about over here the washing of sacrificial parts. The pasuk says, right, literally again, the innards, right, right, and the quarters have to ultimately be washed by water. So what are we dashing from here? Water and not water. B'mayim v'lo b'mazon. Water and not diluted wine. B'mayim l'rabos shar mayim. And ultimately, again, water comes to include all types of water. V'kal v'chomer l'mei kiyar. And a kal v'chomer ultimately, again, to the water of the kiyar. Where it says, hold up. What does that mean? My kal v'chomer l'mei kiyar. What does that mean, kal v'chomer l'mei kiyar? Lav d'mayim chayim ninhu. Rabbi say, is it not saying that the kiyar needs to be spring-fed water? Does that not mean that it needs to be spring-fed water? The Gemara says, so again, what it's saying over here is, if you could use this water, regular water, to wash sacrificial parts, certainly you could use the water of the kiyur, which is what? Spring-fed water, to wash sacrificial parts. But this is seeming to indicate to us that the water of the kiyur is spring-fed. Lo the kiddush, the Gemara says lo the kaddish. Rabbi said the Gemara says as follows. No, halacha l'maisa. What it means is that Rashi says lo the kadshi umekir mamish kayala b'kavachomer sherochtzin b'memeha kravim kavachomer shalan the kadshu. Rabbi said rather what it's saying is that halacha l'maisa, even though the waters of the kiyur are not spring fed, they could still be used to wash the sacrificial parts. The Gemara says v'kadishi mal yusahi, and ultimately again it is a proper kiddush. Rabbi Shmuel, Ma'im she'en lem shem levai. So Rabbi Shmuel said like this. So both sides. Now, interestingly enough, Rashi says over here, he's not sure exactly what this is referring to, but we'll see in just a moment. Rashi says, the times that you shall say like this. When you use water, you have to use water that doesn't have a shem levai. Both say shem levai means any type of description or appellation. The Gemara says, Yatsu amud beis, Yatsu mekir sheish lam shem levai. This comes to exclude the water of the kiyur, which has like a descriptive name, because it's not just called water. What is it called? It's called mei kiyur. The Gemara says, Elalav deruyin lamei kiyur, alma mayim chaim ninu. Rather, again, it must be water that is fit for the mei kiyur. And this is seen to indicate to us what? That in fact the kiyur has to be spring fed. To which the Gemara says, in reality, tanoihi. This is a machlokes tanoim. Shabbos says it's really fascinating. Where does the water of the kiyar have to come from? Then Rabbi Yochanan, mei kiyar, Rabbi Shmuel Omer mei mayon hein, the Chum Omrim shar memos hein. So ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan says that, Rabbi Shmuel says it has to come from a spring. And Rabbi say, by the way, which is not the biggest deal in the world, because remember, in the Beis Hamikdash was a subterranean spring. So it's not like it's a difficulty, but Lamaisa again, Rabbi Shmuel says, Halach Lamaisa must come from a spring. Chum say shar memos hein. It need not be spring-fed water. Rabbi say the Rambam Paskins, like the Chachamim. Let's just give it. That's okay. It's fine. Rambam says it has to be like the Chachamim. Ultimately, again, has to be like the Chachamim. Ultimately, again, and therefore the water need not be spring-fed water. So that's why he passed Halacha L'Maisa. So it's very interesting. So if I just want to point out something very interesting, so what you see from here is as follows. In certain respects, right? So kiyar and mikvah share a lot of similarities, but even there, not total similarities, right? Because remember, again, a mikvah doesn't have to be spring-fed, but a mikvah also can't be mayim shuvin. It can't be drawn water. Or start as rainwater. So, but a kiyar can be fully drawn water. But you would, as halacha essentially would thank you, we begin to see it as follows. You really have on one hand kiyar and mikvah, which is like in one category, and then in the other category, natilas daim. Natilas daim is very easy. What do you need for natilas daim? What do you need for natilas daim? Water. How much of it? How much of it? Minimum of a revius. For kiddush adayim, for raglayim, and for mikvah, you have a lot more flexibility with the type of liquids. And for kiyar, it does not need to be rainwater, does not need to be spring water, could be any water. Ultimately, again, and as we've said, has to be kiyar, has to have enough to wash 4 kohanim simultaneously, but a kohen could use any klisharis for kiddush adayim, raglayim, and any amount of water. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Arel. So we'll say, so now we're going down the list. Arel. So remember again, if an Arel does the avoda, ultimately again the avoda is invalid. Says the Gemara, where do you know that from? The truth is, we'll say, interestingly enough, this is not written in the Torah. It's fascinating, right? That an uncircumcised Kohen can't do the avoda is not written in the Torah. Where is it written? So it's written in Yecheskel. What does Yecheskel say? Kol ben nechar ara leiv va'ara basar lo yaval mikdashi. Now I will say there's a lot of stuff in this pasuk. Kol ben nechar, a foreign person, arel leiv of uncircumcised heart, va'arel basar, our uncircumcised flesh, lo yaval al mikdashi l'sharaseni, cannot come into my Beis Hamikdash to go out and serve me. The Gemara says uminalan demachli avoda. And how do you know, by the way, how do you know that if an uncircumcised Kohen did the avoda, that the avoda is invalid? Where do you know that from? Dichsiv, b'haviachem es b'nei nechar ar le'lev v'ar le'basar lios b'mikdashi lechalel es beisi. Because the rest of the pasuk says that if they go out and they serve, lechalel, they profane my home. So from here we see ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, that a Kohen who is in Orel is not only unfit to do the avoda, but if he does so, the avoda itself is invalid. Incredible. The Gemara goes back to Tanabanon. Ben Nechar, Yochel Ben Nechar Mamish. So we'll say, Tasik says Ben Nechar. I would have thought Ben Nechar Mamish. Now we'll say, now, what does Ben Nechar literally mean? What does it literally refer to? A Gentile. Right? That's literally what a Ben Nechar is. So I would have thought the pasuk is actually saying that a guy, that a Gentile is not allowed to do the avoda. Okay. I mean, that seems to be pretty obvious. The Gemara says, Tambalomar Aralev. Therefore, the pasuk says of uncircumcised heart. So we'll say, what's uncircumcised heart? That's someone who has religious issues, right? In other words, that's talking about, again, someone who is not whole with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's an arla, there's a foreskin over my heart, there's a barrier. Imke Tambalomar Ben Nechar. So we'll say, so what's a Ben Nechar? So which the Gemara says, it's a modifier. Shenisnachru masav la'aviv sheba shamayim. So we'll say, so essentially, what Ben Nechar does is because it's called Ben Nechar, Orel Leiv. Essentially, Ben Nechar explains what Orel Leiv is. What does it mean, uncircumcised heart? What does that mean? Someone who is uncircumcised heart, I will say, is a Ben Nechar, is a son whose actions are alien in the eyes of his father. So we'll say, so essentially, Aralev means a son who alienates himself from his father by engaging in activity that the father does not approve of. That's what it means. And I will say there's something fascinating. When I am a Ben Nechar, which guess inevitably we all are at different times in life. If I am a son, ultimately again, who engages in behavior that alienates him from his father, what does it do over time? That makes me an Ara leif. That creates a barrier over my heart. It's like a cause and effect. See, Rabbi say, if we delve down a little bit, part of the psychology of sin, right? Why do we sin? Why do we sin? So we like to think that it's because of gaiva, arrogance, taiva, desire. At the end of the day, that's all true. But the reason I also sin is because I assume that I could do an avera and still be the same person. Right? That's deep down what this is all about. I'm going to do what I want. I love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Let's say we never stop loving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I love Torah. I love everything. But I also want to do what I want to do. And I make the assumption that I can do what I want to do, and it's not going to have a residual effect on me. That's how we operate. I can engage in negative behavior, but still be the same good person. There's only one little problem with that, which is it's fundamentally false. Everything we do has a profound effect on us. So if I'm going to be a ben nechar, if I'm going to be a child who engages in alien behaviors that my father does not approve of, the result of that is I'm going to become an ara leif. There's going to be a barrier that forms over my heart. There's going to be like a, so to speak, like a spiritual foreskin that goes ahead and forms over my neshama. I'm going to be distanced and I'm going to become a changed person. Every single thing we do has an effect on who and what we are. There is no such thing as an small that does not fundamentally shape me and change me in some way. So if I'm going to be a ben nechar, just understand what is going to happen is I'm going to become an ara leif. Tremendous. The Gemara says, "Ve'ini ela ara leif." So I only know now that a Kohen who is spiritually impeded, spiritually handicapped, right, who's engaging in behaviors that are foreign in the eyes of HaKadosh and therefore has an arla over his heart, he can't do the avoda. The Gemara says, "Ara basar minayin." I don't know that quite clearly. Uncircumcised Kohen can't do the avoda. Talmud lomar ara basar. Ara basar. Therefore, I will say ara basar literally means an uncircumcised Kohen. Now, we'll say, now why do I need both? Why do I need both? Teach me one. I was about to say because to a certain degree they're a little bit one and the same. Obviously, if a Kohen is uncircumcised, it means that Allah again, he's a ben nechar. He's engaged in activities that his father doesn't like, and therefore he's an ara leif. If he's an ara leif, so why do I need both? I'll tell you why. It's richi. Tikasav rachmana ara basar mishum demas. I would have thought like this: an uncircumcised Kohen can't do the avodah. Why? Because, so to speak, he's physically repulsive. The lack of a bris milah, by definition, makes him physically repulsive in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Therefore, he can't do the avodah. Aval ara leif. The lo ma'is emalo. Rabbi said this is actually quite beautiful. But an ara leif who's not repulsive in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rabbi said, is that not the most beautiful line you've ever read in your entire life? Even when I become an ara leif, even if I'm a ben nechar, and therefore as a result an ara leif, right? Even though I'm a person who has engaged in activities that are foreign in the eyes of my father, and as a result I have created an arla around my heart, I am not repulsive in the eyes of my father. HaKadosh Baruch Hu always loves me, no matter how badly I mess up, no matter what type of behaviors I'm engaging in. And I will say, herein lies the fundamental distinction between our human relationships and our relationship with Hashem. What's the distinction? What's the distinction? I will say, we like to say in human relationships, right, that there's unconditional love. There is no such thing as unconditional love in any human relationship. Think about the for a moment, right? People like to think, even with parents and children, right? I love my children unconditionally. No, you don't. No, you don't. There are things that children could do that would distance them from a parent. I'll always be your parent. I'll always be your parent. And there will always be a sense of connection and a sense of duty and a sense of responsibility. But are there things that a parent has for them? Absolutely yes. There is no such thing as unconditional love in human relationships. In fact, the only unconditional love that exists in the universe is HaKadosh Baruch Hu for us. Even our love for Him. We don't have unconditional love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't. We unconditional love. We strive for unconditional love. The only true unconditional love in the entire universe is the love that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has for us. Rabbi say, isn't it worth it to learn the entire Shas just to get to Zevachim Daf Chav Beis on the base to learn that even if I am an Orel Lev, a Ben Nechar, and as a result of being a Ben Nechar, I am now an Orel Lev, even so, my father loves me. There's nothing I could do, nothing I could ever do. He might punish me, he might be angry at me, but he never stops loving me. No matter what happens, Kirachem Av al Banim, the Ribono Shel Olam never stops loving me. So the Gemara says, and if it would have just said Aralev, I would have said he's excluded. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, his heart is not with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Aval Aral Basar, the Libal Shamayim Emalotzuich. But I will say an Aral Basar, whose maybe his heart is still to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I will say, if he's an Aral Basar, right, if he's uncircumcised, how can you say that his heart is with Hashem? It's very simple. I will say, there's a classic case of why a Kohen would be uncircumcised. What's the classic case of why a Kohen would be uncircumcised? Rashi says, Mesu achav mach masmila. Today what we know is hemophilia, right? He's uncircumcised because his as a result of bris milah. So then the halacha is that after a certain, right, if his previous, if two that as a result, three depending on the halacha, right? If his brother's that as a result of bris milah, there's obviously something going on over here. He's uncircumcised. Uncircumcised Kohen need not be an act of spiritual rebellion. It might actually be halachically sanctioned uncircumcised kite. But yet, nevertheless, he is still precluded ultimately again from doing the avodah. So again, I would not have been able to learn out one from the other, therefore I need both. Good. Rabbi says just to another line. And Rabbi says that is halacha l'maisa. So whether a Kohen is an Aralev, Rabbi says obviously, no one's going to be able. How do you know if a Kohen is an Aralev? Okay, so obviously there are certain objective metrics. You see him engaging in behavior that is contra to halacha, then he's an Aral Lev. If he's a Ben Nechar Aral Lev, he can't do the avoda. Or ultimately, again, if he's an Aral Basar, you'd have to know that also. But halacha l'maisa, either one of those two disqualifications ultimately preclude him from doing the avoda. Next, says Tamei Pasal. If he does the avoda, ultimately again the avoda is Pasal. Amru Ziknei Daram. Shabbos said this is very interesting. Let's just actually begin this line and we'll stop here for today. Lo Shana Ela Tamei Sheretz. Shabbos said this is very interesting. When do we say that if a Kohen is Tamei and ultimately he does the avoda, that the avoda is compromised? That's if it's Tumas Sheretz. Get ready for this. Aval Tamei Meis. But if he's Tamei Tumas Meis, Mitoch Shemeratze B'tzibor, Meratze Nami B'yachid. Since ultimately, again, Abosai, technically speaking, Tumas Meis is Hutra B'tzibor, right? If 51% of Klal Yisrael is Tamei Tumas Meis, the laws of Tumah ultimately. So too, if a Kohen does individual avodah in a state of Tumas Meis, ultimately again it works. This is mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing. The Gemara says, if that's the case, then accidentally, right, inadvertently in a case of Tumas Sheretz, it should also work. Based on the Kavachomer, from Tumas Meis, Tamei Meis, Sheton Azor Shlishu Shvi Merasa. If Tumas Meis, which is a higher level of Tumah, because it requires sprinkling on days 3 and 7, yet if the Kohen does it in a state of Tumah, the Tamei Sheretz, She'eno Ton Azal Gimel Shvi, Eno Din Shemarasa. So ultimately, again, certainly Tumas Sheretz, which does not require sprinkling of Paraduma on days 3 and 7, if the Kohen did the avodah in that state of Tumah, it should work as well. Kasavi Ziknei Daram. Mechaprim kimiskaprin. Ultimately, we treat the Kohanim like the Klal. How so? Ma miskaprin tamei meis in tamei sheretz lo. Af mechaprin tamei meis in tamei sheretz lo. So we'll stop over here today. But essentially, what the Ziknei Dharma introducing is something very interesting. That it could very well be that the concept is, get ready for this. The concept Tumah Hutra B'tzibor, that when 51% of the Klal is tamei, that the laws of Tumah are suspended, may only be a din by Tumas Meis, and not a din by Tumas Sheretz, despite the fact that Tumas Sheretz is a form of Tumah. Mind-blowing. Mind-blowing, mind-blowing, and Meretz Hashem to be clarified, expounded upon, continued, and resolved tomorrow. Shkayach, everyone.
Why would the Gemara say?